with that, we get to hand it over to my most esteemed fellow UVA alum, John Dickerson, who will lead us in the next discussion.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Christina. Just one more. Thanks to Christina. Thanks to all of you. All the bios are in the book, so you can check that out. For those of you who weren't here earlier, I'm John Dickerson of CBS News, and if you weren't here earlier, lucky for you. You didn't have to hear me speak like an auctioneer. The aim of this session is to explore the two institutions that shape the modern, or two of the institutions that shape the modern presidency. First, the courts, and the second is the political environment. There's been a lot of talk about presidential aggrandizement, but my favorite quote was from Coolidge, who said that a leader should not try to go ahead of the majestic army of human thought and aspiration, blazing new and strange paths. He was the only president who had that sense of restraint. Mostly they have done what Emerson said, which is, when skating over thin ice, our safety is our speed, trying to move as fast as possible and let the courts catch up with them later. So that's where we will start, is on the courts. Barbara Perry, you are the author of the essay that forms the beginning of our conversation, so I'll hand it to you to give us a summary of it.
Thank you, John. Thank you to Bill. Such gratitude to Bill and to Christina Lopez-Guittardi-Chow and our entire team here at the Miller Center has put together this amazing, and I think you will all agree, a very timely conference on the presidency. Now, if you'll all turn in your hymnals to page 34, if you have your briefing materials with you, I did produce, with Bill's superb help and others on the team, but I do take credit for the stroke of the pen or slam of the gavel title, and I thought that did sound like a hymn. We'll close with "Mighty Fortress is Our God" today. So how did this topic develop? Well, it's been a year ago since Bill sent to me a version of the essay that you see at the beginning of the briefing materials, the very superb essay that he wrote with a number of those, again, on the team here, because he had developed this idea that we should talk about the presidency currently and a little bit in historical context. So one of the things that I noticed that wasn't yet being developed in the essay was the court. So I thought, if we're going to talk about presidential power, we certainly should talk about the Supreme Court. And so I suggested that we add that to the mix. So unfortunately, since I said add that to the mix, he then volunteered me to write this essay. But I think about, again, I think he was thinking about the need perhaps for checking power. We've talked about that. But he also asked that I confine this piece to the 21st century. So he said, you don't have to go all the way back to Watergate. And I said, well, the court's been deciding about presidential power for even longer than that. But he said, that's okay, just stick to the 21st century. So for the Miller Center's approach to bipartisanship, nonpartisanship, it just so happens we've had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans in the 21st century as President of the United States. So thinking about the need for checking presidential power, though, left me with this conundrum. How does the U.S. leave room for executive actions that will become celebrated historic landmarks, leading to a more perfect union, while maintaining the constitutional boundaries that preserve our republic? And that query came to me in that form because Bill also very kindly had sent me off to a symposium in July in Washington that was a commemoration of the 75th anniversary of President Truman's signing of the executive order desegregating the U.S. military. And so there was no way, if you think back to 1948 when he signed that executive order, there was no way to get such a policy through Congress. He couldn't have even gotten it past his own party, which was made up in some part by the Dixiecrats. And his own advisors told him not to do it. I don't think not because they thought it was too much power being wielded by the president, but they said, you'll lose the 1948 election if you sign this executive order desegregating the U.S. military. Well, being the stubborn Missouri mule he was, he went ahead and signed it, and now he is celebrated for that. So he not only won the election, but is lauded for this unilateral executive action. But I thought, well, looking at the 21st century, I'll cite some examples of the court checking presidential power and sometimes congressional power, for example, in upholding the enemy combatants' due process rights after 9/11. On the president and immigration policy, presidents have won some and they've lost some in recent years at the court. In the recent student loan forgiveness case, the Biden administration policy failed to survive review by the U.S. Supreme Court. So if you'll notice on your hymnals, most of this last part of my essay is posing questions for our panel today. And I start with number one. If we do have a more conservative court, which I think most people agree that we do, and it's going to be checking a liberal president, either the current one or one who might come in the near future, will the executive push back against the court, a la FDR in the 1930s? Will a more conservative court show allegiance to a future conservative president? How will the court's current unprecedentedly low approval ratings that are the lowest since the Gallup organization and others started taking these ratings in the early 1970s. Those low approval ratings weaken the court's authority. And then finally, I pose what I call an existential question that Sarah and I were talking about at lunch. That is, rather than focusing on the jagged ideological fault lines that we have really talked about in the first two panels today, of polarization, might we search for bright boundaries that protect each branch's constitutional role of checking in the short run, but balancing in the long term? So with that, I want to say about our esteemed group who will be commenting today that every one of them could be on the Supreme Court. We're almost on the Supreme Court. I believe one day we'll be on the Supreme Court. And just keep in mind, I'm a political scientist. I am not a lawyer, but Sarah and I did serve as judicial fellows at the Supreme Court. So I do have the gavel that I got as a souvenir. And it says Supreme Court of the United States on it. So actually, I'll let John have that in case people go over.
Oh. Well, yes, as an undergraduate at the university, the only thing this makes me think of is that many of the people I went to university with were often hammered. Okay, back to the topic at hand.
But I did do my 3 minutes being Germanic and Catholic, right?
That's very good.
Okay, good. Thank you.
A couple of things before we start. We've had two panels before this one, so if anybody in their remarks wants to refer back to something that's been said before, I think it would be useful because the fertilization that comes from crossover is useful. And I think also you should all feel free to enjoy what Senator Jones talked about, which was the senatorial prerogative, which is to say any old damn thing you please, regardless of what my question is, because one of the things I've found, and maybe it's just because I ask bad questions, but is that people often have things about which they're passionate, which my question might not directly get at. So I'll start with you, Bob, and Judge Ludig. On this question, Bob, I'll start with you. A White House has a lot of goals and desires, and we've talked a lot about how campaigns make presidents promise the moon. Sometimes Congress doesn't fulfill its role. The president wants to act. Since you've served inside of a White House, how do you think the lawyers inside think about how much a president can get away with? Do you say, let's try it all and let the judges figure it out? Or take us through that process a little bit, and in so doing, show us the boundaries of how we should think about, at the moment, executive power and how it should be exercised in the system.
It does turn out that presidents like to claim, even for their most controversial actions, that they're lawful. And so it becomes important for them. You could imagine a circumstance where they don't actually care what the lawyers produce. They're going to go ahead and do it anyway and then challenge the Congress to impeach them. But typically they're going to want to make the argument, that's true in international as well as domestic affairs, that what they have done is lawful. And so there is pressure, of course, on lawyers to come up with various legal pathways for the president to execute successfully on policy. And there are just very briefly a couple of places you look in this process for the most activity, and one of which I think, having had the best job I'll ever have in it, I do have some second thoughts about. there's a White House counsel's office, which has grown dramatically in authority and significance over many, many decades. I want to stay in the 21st century for Barbara's caution.
And Bill.
But really, for all intents and purposes, there really wasn't a full-time law firm supporting the president until the Nixon administration, and it was, ironically, I think largely the thought of John Dean that he would build such an office in the presidency, and there's a story behind that. But now we have one, and the White House counsel has a significant staff that can be, depending on circumstances, including the energy behind congressional oversight, it can be up in the 40s. But outside, of course, the White House counsel's office, there are lawyers across the entire panoply of agencies. And in the Department of Justice, of course, there is an Office of Legal Counsel. And the Office of Legal Counsel is expected, by virtue of principles that have been articulated and sitting on its website since at least 2010, but this, by the way, I think is a general understanding of its role, that it gives the president honest and accurate advice. I'm almost quoting from it. It's intended to really give the president straight, fair legal advice, while at the same time, if it cannot give the president the answer the president wants, to offer up reasonable alternatives toward the same goal that would still be lawful. So it's an honest broker of a sort, but with a significant executive branch tilt. Many people understand the White House counsel's office is often the intermediary between the White House and the Department of Justice around significant legal issues that shape or determine what the president can claim is the lawful basis of their actions. And there's been a lot of concern expressed, notably by Bruce Ackerman at Yale, but he's not the only one, that the president has built inside the White House an enabling legal institution. White House counsels are not, and really cannot be subject to confirmation by the Senate. It's not an appointed and confirmed post. It's entirely the president's pick. And presidents have picked White House counsels who were personal friends, personal lawyers, political lawyers, and so of course the natural thought is, well, that's the enabling function. That's what the president is looking for. I think that's quite unfair in many respects. Maybe not in my case, but in others. And I think it's very important for the president to have on hand an office like the White House counsel for the day-to-day work that just has to happen at close quarters between the president and some source of legal support. On the other hand, I think the growth of the White House counsel's office and its role is open to fair comment. And in a book I wrote with Jack Goldsmith, we suggested it be downsized, and many of the functions, or at least many of the activities of the White House counsel's office, be returned to the Department of Justice. And I can talk about the reasons for that, but I won't go into it now. So it's very clear that presidents have available to them a lot of very good lawyers who can develop a lot of very creative theories to support executive action that the reasonable observer at a distance might think is questionable, and that's happened. That's happened a lot. So, I suppose I'll leave it there, except to say that I think it's extremely important, which is one of the reasons I'm concerned about the growth of the White House counsel's office, growth and role of the White House counsel's office. It is important to retain a little bit in executive branch lawyering. When I say a little bit, maybe I'm understating the case, of what's reflected in what I mentioned about the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel's Statement of Best Practices, which is lawyers have an ethical responsibility to be clear with the president that, yes, on the one hand, they're there to support the president in the facilitation of the policy objectives that the president was elected to pursue, but on the other hand, they remain lawyers. And it's very important for them also to warn about the potential consequences of pursuing an action that could be rejected by the courts, or that is going to create a legacy for the president that is not a legacy of responsibly exercised executive authority. And that's very difficult to do under the hothouse pressures of the White House.
Judge Ludig, how do you see the judiciary, either with respect, of course, to the decisions of the president's lawyers, but also, of course, the administrative state, which we've had a lot of talk about here today, and where the authorities are? Who makes the call about if Congress leaves things open and HHS decides they've got a lot of exciting ideas of the ways to interpret that? Who makes the judgment about whether they've gone too far. Give us your perspective on how the judiciary should rein in the executive.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Bill, and the Miller Center. I would just say that I don't know that I belong at this table or any other table inside the Miller Center, but I'm grateful to be here. But I also want to call out several of my friends, longtime, lifetime friends who are here today, not to see me. They just by happenstance happened to be here. And I'd start with Fred McClure. And I know he's on the board of the Miller Center. And next will be Josh Bolton, the best White House chief of staff that we've ever had. And then finally, one of my best and most admired law clerks, Mike Hirschland, is here with me today. So thank all of you for coming, and thank the Miller Center. So I have had the great privilege over an increasingly long lifetime to have worked in both the Office of Legal Counsel that Bob was talking about and also in the White House counsel's office. The former under George H.W. Bush, where I actually headed the Office of Legal Counsel, and the latter when Fred Fielding was the dean of all White House counsels, was White House counsel back in under President Reagan. So for all of my professional career, I've actually been thinking about and addressing all of these issues about the various constitutional powers, including the powers of the presidency of the United States, but also Congress and the courts. And then late in life, over the past 2 years, I've had what I consider the greatest privilege of my life is to address the most profound, far-reaching constitutional questions possible with respect to the separation of powers and the respective powers of the three branches. It's the greatest privilege of my life, primarily because it's the only privilege in my life where I didn't have to get another vote to say what the law is. So as you know, I've not cavalierly, I assure you, but I have had the opportunity to speak to these issues in the past 2 years alone, and I've done so. But to get right to the question, John, so the questions of law that are presented by the exercise of the president's, executive powers that in turn implicate the powers of the Congress and the judiciary are, by and large, unsettled questions of law. Unsettled even after almost 250 years of our nation's history. So that when you're in the Office of Legal Counsel, certainly there, and derivatively when you're in the White House counsel as lawyers, you are invariably addressing questions for which there is no answer. That's one of the wonderful aspects of the privilege of being able to work in those offices. That is also to say that when you say there are no answers, it is to say at the same time that there is no answer in the law, so that when the president is pushing on the outer limits of his executive power, if you will, to make law through executive orders and the like, and even through signing statements when he signs legislation into law. It's one of the most profound responsibilities of the executive power. And until 7 years ago, I was perfectly comfortable with the way that the presidents, to that point, had exercised that quote, lawmaking power. That is to say, I was very comfortable that they had not overreached into the spheres of either the Congress or the judiciary. But former President Trump was the president that our founding fathers and the framers of our Constitution feared most. In their prescience, they feared Donald Trump more than any other figure. And so not only at the convention, but in all of the founding debates and the ratification debates of the Constitution, our founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution spoke as eloquently and profoundly as you could ever imagine about the dangers of a man like Donald Trump ever occupying the presidency. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, even George Washington in his farewell address, that was one of the primary items that he discussed in that well-known farewell address. Whether however you call it or however they denominated the office as being authoritarian. But the basic idea was exactly what we had with the presidency of Donald Trump, which was a president who inflamed the passions of the population, often against the government of the United States and the institutions of our democracy and law. That's what the framers feared most. And so as we go about this discussion and the rest of your discussions, I thought it would just be worthwhile reminding us all that in legalese, Donald Trump was sui generis, which just means we've never had anything like him. Hopefully we will never have anyone like him again. But he pressed the office, the powers of the office of the president beyond their limits. And so I think I'll just end by saying this, as you may have seen me say publicly, I thought that it was imperative that Donald Trump be prosecuted for his grave crimes against the United States of America in and around January 6th, lest he be allowed to make a mockery of America and the Constitution and the laws of the United States. So we just have to keep in mind that he is an aberration. And so while we have to account for the restructuring of the presidency going forward in such ways that will prevent a president like him from succeeding in the future, and we've already begun that with changes to the Electoral Count Act and et cetera, and the 12th Amendment. But, if you take Donald Trump out of the line of presidents that we've had today, then I don't think our discussion wouldn't be nearly as interesting today, and I'm sure you would never have had me come here, but we have to be cautious about that when we make changes of the kind that Bob Bauer and Professor Jack Goldsmith made in their seminal book.
Thank you, Judge Ludig. Before we go back to, this is one of the challenges of covering and talking about the presidency, which is how to talk about the office and the slow-moving and changing, shifting powers that have been going on for a long time, even before the 21st century. And then how much of that was changed, shown to be weak, forever altered, or complete, or by Donald Trump, or is he just a case off to the side and we should go back to that original conversation? So, Tim, I'm going to ask you to try to, since you have such intimate knowledge of the details of from your work with the January 6th committee, can you offer an opinion, and then say whatever you'd like, but an opinion about the extent to which Donald Trump is wholly and separately apart, or ways in which his story and the issues that have yet to be resolved in the courts represent fundamental, enduring, long-standing questions of the sharing of powers in the presidency that we shouldn't necessarily think, well, that's just an idiosyncratic result of an idiosyncratic president?
So I think what happened on January 6th is a demonstration that the rule of law can still prevail. I'm going to strike a more optimistic tone in the 3 or 4 minutes I have than some of the earlier discussion, because I think the rule of law is still alive and well. It was tested on January 6th, but it prevailed, and I think it will continue to prevail going forward. One of the most interesting and important and illustrative pieces of testimony that we got on the January 6th committee came from Bill Stepien, who was the campaign manager for President Trump, longtime Republican operative, very experienced. And he described what happened right after the election as a battle between groups of lawyers who he called Team Crazy and Team Normal. And it's his term, not ours. But he described, the sort of political and legal professionals in the White House, in the campaign, and in the world, in the Justice Department, as Team Normal, telling the president the truth. You've lost the election. Here's why you've lost the election. They filed a bunch of lawsuits unsuccessfully. But then Team Crazy increasingly became more and more prominent. That was Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and all the others who were sort of telling him what he wanted to hear, that there was some sort of path, factually or legally, there. And they lost, right? Like, it was close. To use a sports analogy, this was, a 98 to 97 game with maybe a last-second shot at the buzzer that wins, but Team Normal was victorious, and the rule of law prevailed. A lot of good lawyers did the right thing. Right? Bill Barr told the truth about the election. Mike Pence did the right thing when it came to the limits of his authority. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. We've looked at these. So a lot of good lawyers on Team Normal did the right thing, and they prevailed. But it required that for that outcome to happen. Going forward, if you're looking at the effect of January 6th and accountability, the rule of law is marching forward. Right? The January 6th facts that were developed by our committee were handed with a criminal referral to the Department of Justice, to a special prosecutor who took that foundation and has only built upon it and issued criminal indictments. And those criminal indictments are a test of the system. I personally think, like Judge Ludig just said, that the accountability really has to be present if we're going to restore faith, if people in this country are going to believe in the system, in the rule of law. And if a former president of the United States can be prosecuted just like a shoplifter or a drug seller, if the system can work for both ends of our society equally, that has the potential to restore faith. So yeah, we live in a polarized time. We live in a time where there's a lot of acrimony and there's a lot of division. But there are these immutable principles, and I think the rule of law is one of them, which has the potential to be an anchor. And it has the potential, if it works, and I think it will work in this case. I think by middle of the spring, there will likely, in my view, likely be a criminal conviction of a former president of the United States of a serious federal crime. Some people are going to hate that, are going to decry that as a product of a rigged system. But a lot of other people, I think, will see that as, okay, that might change public opinion in a way that our congressional process didn't, the media doesn't. There's lack of faith in those institutions, but maybe not in the criminal justice system. There might be a faith there that moves the needle and gets us past this acrimonious chapter. So I think the rule of law is alive and well, and in the midst of all of this acrimony that we've been talking about, it has the potential to be a through-line thread that keeps us on course and maybe restores some faith.
Cy and Sarah, I want to go back to this question of the sharing of powers, and I know we're supposed to stay in the more recent history, but when we talk about the law, of course, much of the conversation goes back to the original founding ideas. So we can't, we should do that. And we have a situation where you have White Houses, Cy, where, presidents make treaties, they declare war, they legislate, essentially, none of which they're really supposed to be doing, I think. How did we get there, and well, where are we? How did we get where we are in terms of your view of where the presidency has overstepped its bounds, and what can be done to put things back in balance, and who's responsible for putting things back in balance? Is it Congress? Is it judges? Is it that self-restraint that White Houses should have?
Well, I like everybody else, I'd like to thank the Miller Center for putting this on and for inviting me. How did we get here? I mean, I think there's just been remarkable changes to our country and to our conception of the presidency. The founders didn't expect parties. They didn't expect presidents to run on a party platform or a presidential platform, and that has consequences for what presidents do when they become president. I mean, they basically ran on their resumes for the most part, and early on, they refused to make promises. They thought it was corrupting. And of course, it is corrupting, I think, to make a promise. Just imagine what it would be like for Supreme Court justices to make promises, right? It seems funny to us now, but if you do that for 20 or 30 years, it seems entirely normal. And it's become normalized for presidents to do that as well. And so if you've got parties that have a party platform and presidents that are shaping the party platform and making it their own, you've got these enormous expectations that you've written about, John, on the presidency. My recollection is that Al Gore talked about traffic problems as president, or as a candidate for president, and that's it seems sort of absurd, but that's the level of involvement people feel the president should have in the country. Obviously, there's greater polarization today than there was 30 or 40 years ago, and Congress is far more weak because of people looking to the president for leadership, policy, and party-wise. They just can't hold a candle to the president's influence, and they're afraid of the president. At least Republican members have been quite afraid of Donald Trump. Every one of them that opposed him either lost or decided not to run. It's extraordinary. It's happened before. I mean, I think Sid's talked about this. I mean, FDR ran against a lot of the Southern Democrats. I don't think he had as much success as Donald Trump did. And then I think, this question of legality in the presidency is wrapped up in a larger conversation about the Constitution. Many people in the country and many people in this room think the meaning of the Constitution ought to change over time, and that the meaning of laws ought to change over time. And there's certainly a reason why you might think that. I mean, very good reasons. But if that's true, then why not the constitutional powers of the president? Why would that be the one institution that's going to not change? And of course, it's followed the same path, right? And you described treaties and declaring war and really changing the law, right? Sometimes because Congress has authorized the president, but sometimes because the courts have just decided to abandon their traditional practice of independently construing the statutes of Congress and not showing excessive deference to the president. So, I think, Bob was talking about getting multiple opinions and how that can give the president more leeway. People forget George Washington got multiple opinions from different cabinet officers about all kinds of legal questions, and no one accused him of opinion chopping because they perceived that he was trying to follow the law. He was getting different opinions about whether the Bank of the United States was constitutional, and he ended up signing it. But I think the perception today is that perhaps the president's less concerned about following the law, executing the law, more interested in getting reelected. And if you think that's the motivation of the president, then presenting that president with multiple legal opinions does enable the president, even if every single participant believes that they're honestly giving their, sincere opinion about the law, because the decision maker isn't as concerned about it. So I guess, some of these things can't be undone. I mean, I'm not sure we're going to go back to an era where presidency, I'm not going to make a single promise. I don't know how you get rid of parties. It doesn't seem like that's going to be possible. I don't see why polarization can't change. I think, didn't Congressman Jones say that, or sorry, Senator Jones say that we should, maybe get rid of gerrymandering? I don't see why Congress, I think Congress could legally pass a law saying districting will be done by computer and there won't be any politicians involved, and there'll be equipopulous districts, and I think that would have an effect on the composition of Congress, and I think it would be a more moderate result. I don't know that as a fact. I haven't run the simulation, but I think there are things that can be done. But my work is so far focused on how we got here, and probably Bob's book is better at figuring out what ought to be done.
Sarah, we've had a lot of talk about the administrative state so far here today, and the idea that basically there are a number of people as a part of the 2 million federal workforce who have more power than they should have. What role does, how far should judges go in terms of that stepping in, being deferential to what the administration or the administrative state has done as a part of practice? And since you have experience both inside and outside, also I would add one other thing, which is some of these so-called independent agencies. I mean, the FTC is being extremely active right now, and for a lot of people, they think, well, maybe that's a little more active than we signed up for. So how should the line be drawn between what administration must do to keep its promises and where the judiciary should step in?
Well, like Tim, I want to be an optimist, and I will answer your question, but want to also lift up Barbara's beautifully phrased existential question in her essay about, may we discover bright boundaries that protect the checking and balancing functions of the courts and the presidency? And my answer is resoundingly yes. I think one of the most significant categories of bright boundaries is actually internal, informal controls, adherence to customs and norms and indeed doctrines that practitioners in both the judicial branch as well as the executive branch, if they adhere to, solidify the rule of law. For courts, adherence to stare decisis, yes, many judicial candidates have made promises about such things. Constitutional avoidance doctrine, open dockets rather than shadow dockets, adherence to ethical norms, personal integrity. On the executive side, checks on unilateralism, and I'll get to the administrative state. One of them is the sometimes frustrating, but I think important transitory nature of some presidential unilateralism, recess appointments. I was a recess appointed judge. I became a pumpkin once Congress adjourned. The session after I was appointed unilaterally by the president. Executive orders. As someone who represents companies in and their interests in front of administrative agencies, some of which are run by a single administrator, presidentially appointed and removable at will, others that are independent, bipartisan by statute, commissions, protected from removal other than for cause. I bemoan, actually, the Biden administration's rescission of a Trump administration executive order that implemented a civil Brady rule requiring administrative agencies to produce exculpatory information in the context of administrative investigations and enforcement actions. Because administrative adjudications, rulemaking activity is not typically subject to the adversary system, civil discovery, transparency practices, and they get deference in courts of law so far. And all of those, so therefore I thought that that executive order actually promoted democratic aims. Quick story, when I was in the White House counsel's office, in addition to judicial selection, I was in charge of what we then called the gun control portfolio, might now be called gun safety. And one of my tail end of the Clinton administration duties was to shop around a potential executive order limiting agency purchases of weapons to gun manufacturers who had signed up for certain gun safety checks and features. We were mindful of the checking power of the third branch, and ultimately that executive order, we were worried it would be struck down and challenged in court. So it actually wasn't, it never went into effect. So, you know, again, that's another checking power on unilateral power of the president. Bob Bauer mentioned the intermediary function served by the White House counsel's office between the Department of Justice and the White House, the president. One of my duties with gun control was also sadly during episodes of school shootings, the president would want to put out a statement in support of gun safety legislation and other measures. This was actually a time when the assault weapon ban was in effect. And to avoid the appearance of interfering in law enforcement investigations, as a lawyer, I was the one to call the Department of Justice, not anyone from the political offices, not anyone from the Chief of Staff's office, for example. So these are customs, norms, practices. They're informal. But nevertheless, they helped to ensure that the rule of law will prevail. I was watching the fascinating interview by Representative Jamie Raskin of Cassidy Hutchinson a few days ago at GW. Shout out to public television. And one of the most poignant points that she made was that when she entered her position in the Trump White House, the office of the Chief of Staff, she did not view herself as a loyal servant of a personality, of an individual human being, the president or Mark Meadows. She viewed herself as being a servant of the office, of the function of the office. Now, obviously, that became a tension that must have been almost unbearable as a result of the January 6th insurrection, but her willingness to be a profile in courage, really at the risk of threats to her own life, to stand up for those customs, norms, institutional loyalties, as opposed to the power of a personality, or the reason that I am optimistic. Just quickly on the deep state, I hate that phrase. The reason I hate that phrase is that I think it is negative. I think it is born of an ideological agenda. As Chris Liddell said in the earlier panel, administrative agencies are heterogeneous, they're not monolithic. Yes, they have some powers, and I just spoke of a few. They do have, I believe, sometimes a thumb on the scale of justice that needs reform, but they also do the everyday work of government. And as former Attorney General Janet Reno used to say, political appointees, cabinet officials, we are the Christmas help. And it is the permanent government, loyal public servants committed to executing faithfully the laws that make up our democratic government. Those, that's the deep state. And I just want to end on a note of optimism. Another reason that I don't like that phrase is because I think it turns off young people. The average age in this room is probably, I'm going to say not 35. I don't think it's quite double that, but we want young people. We're in a university setting. I work in a law firm where every year the lion's share of the work is done by recent graduates from law school, fresh out of judicial clerkships. We want people, the young people, the next generation, to serve faithfully in institutions of government, as well as serve in private practice. But I think if we tarnish the reputation of public service with negative phrases like the deep state, I think we do damage to the willingness of the next generation to serve in those very necessary public positions.
Thank you, Sarah. We're going to switch to the second portion of this topic, but I'd like to come back, if we have time, to all of you who've spoken already. Barbara is exempted from this because she already posed the questions, but we want to be thinking forward about the challenges in this area of discussion that we've had. So if you can think of one question when I come back to you in 45 minutes or so, that all of us who care about these balances and this institution should have in mind when we think about the right role and the right line drawing between the powers of the presidency and the powers of the judiciary to check that, and the role of other institutions in getting that balance right. I'll come back to you, and we can all take those questions away from us or away with us. But at the moment, we are going to discuss the second essay in our conversation, which is by and Jen Lawless is going to help us out here. You didn't write it, but Paul Light did. But I'm going to just tee up the question, which is an enormous one. But why do presidents fail?
I can do this in like 10 seconds.
Yeah. Bad spelling.
That's vice president. So if you read Paul's essay, the main point that he's getting at is that I think public opinion is not consistent with presidents succeeding these days. And it's not only that people don't trust government, it's not only that they want government reform that they're not seeing, but it's also that they're splintered in terms of what kind of government reform they want and how those differences break down by party lines. And I don't know that there's anything in the essay that's incorrect, but I do think that it is based on two fundamental assumptions that are somewhat problematic given what I know about the American people. And I spend all of my time doing public opinion research. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be the voice of optimism here. I'm going to be a complete dark cloud because I spend a lot of time looking at survey data, and it doesn't look good. So I would say there are two broad dynamics that speak to why presidents fail. And I think that one way to think about it is we've always known that we've said for a long time, presidents can fail because they misgauge their mandate, or presidents fail because they're not delivering to the American people what the American people wanted. We're at a point in time right now where the American people are so divided that until we have a fundamentally different composition in Congress, and until we have a fundamentally different electoral system, it's hard to imagine the American people ever coming back together. And so these two challenges make it almost impossible for any president to win, at least as far as public opinion is concerned. So the first challenge has to do with what Americans know, or maybe it's better to say what they don't know about politics. And they don't know a lot. So we do know that they know if the president is a Democrat or a Republican. They know if they're a Democrat or a Republican. And we know that they're more inclined to trust government, and they're more inclined to favor and approve of the president when the president shares their own party. That's about it in terms of what we can expect of Americans when they're thinking systematically about the executive branch. So we know, for example, from Paul's essay that the federal government's job rating is falling astronomically, but if we then look at Pew data from just a couple of months ago, people were asked whether they had a positive or negative opinion of 17 different agencies. So federal agencies that fall within the executive branch. Democrats and Democratic leaners had a net positive response, I mean, sometimes up to 80% when it came to the CDC, for example, on all 17 agencies. Even Republicans who don't like Joe Biden, who don't like the White House, who don't like the executive branch of government, gave 10 of the 17 a positive rating, and they approved of the job that these agencies were doing. So right off the bat, people don't necessarily know what they're talking about when they're being asked, do they approve of the government or the federal agencies? Similarly, here are a couple more snippets of public opinion data. People who receive Medicare, among Medicare recipients, 40% of them said that they have never received any government assistance. Among food stamp recipients, this is among actual food stamp recipients, 25% said that they have never received any government assistance. And among people that actually get like an entitlement, like money, about 20% say that they have never received any kind of government assistance. If you talk about Pell Grants or student loan aid or anything else that's a little bit more removed from actual government services, the numbers go way up. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not only that people don't necessarily think about government agencies when they're thinking about their overall assessment of government, but when they're talking about whether they believe in smaller or bigger government, they're not actually aware of what the government does or what programs they're benefiting from. So that's the first challenge that I think makes it really difficult to figure out what Americans want from government reform. They don't know what government is, and they don't know what reform means. The second big challenge is that we've reached a point in time where Democrats and Republicans and partisanship in general has become a social identity, the same way that race or gender or religiosity has in the past. And you're on a team, you're on the D team or you're on the R team. And if your team puts forward a proposal, you like it. And if the other team puts forward the same proposal, you don't. And that also makes it really difficult to think about government reform, because we're not at a point in time where elected officials have much of an incentive to compromise, and we're not at a point in time where voters have much of an incentive to gain a lot of information so that they can understand the nuances of what their elected officials are doing. And then the final point that I would make is that when thinking about the future and when thinking about how to increase presidential success, at least as gauged by voter opinion and presidential approval, we have to keep in mind that affective polarization is at least as strong as substantive polarization. So for a long time, the Democrats and the Republicans have not agreed on policy. They haven't agreed on the best way to bring about policy. They haven't agreed on the size of government. But we've reached a point in time now where they really don't like each other at all. And there are polls that show that, a majority of Democrats think that Republicans are closed-minded, dishonest, and immoral. A majority of Republicans think that Democrats are unintelligent and lazy. Generally speaking, about 50% of Democrats and Republicans are willing to associate these negative traits with members of the other party. But I just want to give you two examples of questions that I asked a couple of months ago on a national survey. So the first question asked Democrats, would you rather have dinner with Donald Trump or have a colonoscopy, 53%. Spend a night in jail, 51%. Get audited by the IRS, 49%. Play a real-life version of the Squid Game, 28%. Okay, so you'd basically rather die than have dinner with Donald Trump. And we asked Republicans, would you rather have dinner with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or have a colonoscopy, 36%, spend a night in jail, 28%, dine with Kim Jong-un, 32%, get a mild case of COVID, 31%. It's hard to see how to bridge the divide when, even whether you're talking about sincere questions or silly questions or policy outcomes, we're so far away from each other. So I do not think that we are in a situation where any president for the foreseeable future is ever going to receive an overwhelming endorsement on the part of the American people or an overwhelming sense of support for any kind of reform that he or she might bring forward. So I'm sorry that I deviated from the essay, but I didn't write it.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Pete Wehner, what role, and again, we get into a Donald Trump challenge here, but I leave it to you to solve it. What role do presidents play in our current partisan fix?
I think it's mixed. Polarization has gone up under every president since Reagan. So I don't think you can pin it to any single individual. These are really deep currents that have happened, and I think polarization has increased with every subsequent president. So Reagan to Bush, Bush to Clinton, Clinton to Bush, Bush to Obama, Obama to Trump, and now to Biden. And so obviously those are Republican and Democratic presidents. So when we're talking about polarization, I think we have to disaggregate the problem and think through what are these trends that have been in motion for a long time, and I think that's a complicated question. I think some of it is our political system, and I think some of it is social change. And I also think that presidents generally, and the people who work for presidents, and I've been in 3 administrations, the Reagan, Bush 41, and then in the Bush 43 White House, probably assume that we have greater capacity to influence events and influence public opinion than is warranted. That isn't always the case, but I think as a general matter, there are more constraints than we think. I would say in the current context that presidents probably have more capacity to accelerate polarization than they have the capacity to mitigate it. Joe Biden, and again, I'm a lifelong Republican, at least pre-2016, and I think whatever you think of Joe Biden's policies, and I think he's done some things well and some things not, I think in the arena of polarization, he's actually done quite well. He's been remarkably careful in his rhetoric, and I think gone out of his way not to be provocative in a lot of situations when he could have been. And I respect him for that, and I appreciate that. I also think that it hasn't really affected polarization itself. He's a reviled figure in the Republican Party, in many respects, a hated figure. And I think that underscores the limitations to be able to fix things. I would also one other thing, and then I want to talk a little bit about Donald Trump, because I think it'd be an affectation to try and ignore it, to ignore it. There are moments that happen in the life of a presidency that can give you the opportunity to unite a country, or moments in which, if you mishandle it, it can divide it. And you just have to be alert to that. So when we were in the White House, 9/11 happened. Now that had a unifying effect almost instinctively for the country. But I think President Bush, in those moments, did things to be able to bring the country together, whether it was going to the Islamic Center that he did just several days after 9/11 happened, the speech that he gave at National Cathedral, which was 3 days after the attack, which is, I think, one of the most theologically sophisticated speeches any American president has ever given, than when he went to New York with a bullhorn. So I think he acted in ways that brought the country together. Now, as the administration went on, we took decisions that were very controversial, and that dissipated as well. So I think you have to be alert to moments that allow you to bring the country together that wouldn't exist normally. In terms of Donald Trump, we're not in normal times. It's interesting, Judge Ludick, who's been a heroic figure in my estimation in terms of the way he has spoken out, he used a term that I had actually in my notes, which is that Donald Trump is sui generis. And this country reached a kind of inflection point with this presidency. We're different now than we were before it. Whether we can recover or not is an open question, because the drama hasn't been written. We're sort of in the midst of a drama. Other presidents, first other presidents came into the presidency genuinely wanting to unite the country, and those were Democrat and Republicans. They didn't always do it. I think Donald Trump came in wanting to divide the country. That is, the intention was different. And the other thing is that every president knows there are extremes within his own party or her own party, and historically they have tried, sometimes imperfectly, to contain those extremes. Donald Trump did the opposite. He mainstreamed them, and he essentially took off the restraints and let everything open. So it's a kind of nihilistic effect. And when a president does that, that's just profoundly destructive to the country, and we really haven't experienced anything like it before. We just haven't had a president who attempted a coup. We didn't have a president who inspired a violent insurrection. We didn't have a president who threatens judges and jurors and prosecutors. And we haven't had a president who encourages political violence. I think as long as he is around at a presence and his ethos is around in a presence, and it's important, it's not confined to a single individual. It's a party now. It's a party that is, in many respects, fundamentally anti-democratic, and we just have to name that and acknowledge it. And as long as those conditions are in place, depolarization is a pipe dream. The immediate task we have is a monumental task, which is to save liberal democracy as we know it. The interesting thing is I imagine that these days former Republicans say that maybe even more than Democrats do today. That I just feel like I don't think that's optimistic or pessimistic. I know it's not optimistic, but I do think it's realistic. Yeah. Tim, who did fantastic work on the January 6th committee, I mean, I agree with you, the rule of law prevailed, but I would say barely. And I would also say that during the Trump presidency, there were multiple institutional collapses. It was the judiciary that did not collapse, and thank God for that. But there's no guarantee that that won't happen a second time. And we should know it because I think Trump supporters know it as well. The last thing I'll say, it's not polarization per se, but what is interesting about Donald Trump here just descriptively, in terms of advocacy, because we've talked about the limits of the presidency, what is striking to me is how fundamentally he changed the Republican Party. I'd argue that Trump's imprint on the GOP exceeds that of Ronald Reagan. And I would say that there was nobody close prior to Trump that changed a party as much as Reagan had changed the Republican Party. But I think Trump has done that in policy. I mean, if you look at free trade, if you look at America's role in the world, if you look at immigration, but I think most especially on these sort of fundamental questions of democracy. So I don't know. I feel like I'm going around banging pots and pans, but I feel like it's worth it.
Well, and Pete, when you mentioned presidential moments when there's an opportunity for a president to bind up a country, we are sitting in one of them. Charlottesville was one of those moments. Yep. Okay, Leah Wright-Rigger, partisan, we've been talking about polarization. People think about it in terms of left and right, but I was struck by a Pew poll recently that found 3/4 of Americans, 77%, say the economic system in the country unfairly favors powerful interests. A president has to deal with that kind of atmosphere as well. I mean, so it's not just the political atmosphere, which we've talked about. What are your thoughts about the larger public that a president has to operate in, and those kinds of numbers, which those are both Democrats and Republicans who are answering a poll that way, and there's the sense of inequality, a sense of the political institutions aren't meeting the moment for people's concerns. How does that affect a president and our politics?
Right. So first, thank you for having me, and thank you for the Miller Center for, I think, doing this. The conversation has been absolutely, I think, illuminating. And I know I myself have learned a lot today. I do think that we have danced around the question of a couple of different questions and a couple of different elements, but in particular, the question of economic inequality, the question of race, and the question of culture, and the effect on the executive branch, on the presidency. And so what I'd like to do is really think about it, particularly given the number, John, that you just shared, is really invert the lens by which we have been examining these questions. So we've been looking at it really from kind of a top-down perspective. And I wonder, how does our assessment change when we look at it from a ground-up perspective? And I think when you begin to do that, what you see is that we're going through a moment, what I call a crisis of executive legitimacy. And in essence, it's rooted in a kind of racial and economic and cultural polarization that is deeply intertwined and can't be separated out from political polarization, right? It's something that has long historical roots, and even though I'm a historian by training, I will not bore you with that history right now, unless you guys want to. But it's something that really emerges explicitly in 2009 with the election of Barack Obama and the emergence of the American Tea Party and the conservative movement. Again, in 2011, with the kind of rapid rise and fall of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I think again in 2013 with the birth of the movement for Black Lives, right? And so there's this kind of power of socio-political movements. I think when we look at it, these kind of economic, socio-political movements, to drive the political actions of the executive branch. So in other words, it matters what people on the ground, not just what they think, but also what they do. We have very good data about this, particularly in American political development, around how elites actually find their donor influence, find themselves influenced by what the base of a particular party is doing, right? Like that influences the direction. And so I think part of what we can begin to do is think of the presidency in the context of the executive office as a symptom of the polarization, this kind of broad polarization that I characterized, that also has the power to exacerbate, or we've used the language of accelerate, just basically make worse. Right? And I do, again, when I think about that, this social political movement, I do want to ask the question of, is there a difference between social political movements, this kind of social political movements that I've named, that we've seen, and is there a difference between that and populism, right, in the kind of populist tenor that we've talked about? I actually think that they are similar and they have overlaps. They're perhaps not one and the same, but they have really a kind of tight intersections. The other thing to consider here is that social movements, particularly these movements, I think, around the intersection of economics and race, have the power to change the relationship between political elites and citizens. And this kind of movement, or this broader movement around the idea of illegitimacy in the state is a prime example of that. So we see, for example, if I can go back for a second, that the language of economic illegitimacy and the failures of the state emerges both with Obama and the Tea Party, but also the Occupy Wall Street movement. It develops into a kind of broad-based rhetoric that is not picked up in terms of policy, say, by the right, or really by the left, but gets picked up and is used as political momentum. Right? So this is what happens when we see, for example, and I mentioned to several of you at lunch already today, in the closing days of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, where he is talking about going after the global cabal of Goldman Sachs. Right? So we have anti-Semitism tied into this kind of economic populist strain that was made popular through the Occupy Wall Street movement and through the Tea Party movement, but doesn't actually produce any legitimate policy, at least in that moment. And I don't necessarily know that it needs to produce policy, particularly because of some of the reasons that, Jennifer, you pointed out in your comments, which is that in a particular moment, people are less interested in ideas of policy, actual, real, hard, tangible policy, than they are in the rhetoric surrounding ideas of policy. The other thing I think that's worth discussing here as we think about the various reasons is this larger idea of the failure or perceived failures of the state and how these things overlap and get picked up. And so I want to talk, first I want to mention 2020. I think we talked about earlier, I believe it was Fred who mentioned that 2020 is a turning point. It is a turning point because it explicitly builds on these earlier movements. But May 2020 is a particular turning point with George Floyd, where we see 26 million people around the globe really rally and come out in the midst of a pandemic around many of these ideas, saying that the state has failed, that they've repeatedly failed, that political institutions have failed, that healthcare has failed, that the police have failed, right? Every single thing has failed. And so this is a reaction to what they call the failure of democracy. I think that is intertwined with the subsequent, roughly 8 months later, January 6, 2021, with the attempted overthrow of, the sacred halls of Congress in the attempt to overthrow the election. That is very much rooted in a reaction to this perceived failure of democracy that comes out of the George Floyd movement. You cannot understand one without the other, right? So they build on each other. So the final point before I jump into, I have two questions, I think, for the larger audience, and two questions that I think should be picked up as research questions. The final point is that, again, I want to revisit this as the president or the presidency, the executive branch, is a reaction. Right? It is a larger symptom of something else, right? To this polarization. Again, of course, the president has the power to make things worse, right? And to exacerbate things. But it's also true that the president is picking up on these trends and these themes that exist, that I think have been worsened by the development of, for example, social media and technologies that allow people to bypass traditional ideas of what is fact, right? We're in a post-fact world, and create their own media. So here are my questions that I think are useful research framing questions. The first is if the executive branch can exacerbate or worsen polarization that comes from the ground. Right? Is it safe to say that the executive branch also has the ability to repair that, to successfully repair that? I think, Pete, you said Biden had kind of repaired it, but I mean like actually bring kind of these poles together again, particularly given the question of economics, race, culture, identity. That's the first one. The second question, and I think is a much harder question, if illegitimacy of the state, right, or the crisis of the executive legitimacy is rooted in a fundamental belief that the state has failed, right? And it comes from a kernel of truth, right? That is actually what makes the most effective kind of division. It has to be rooted in some kernel of truth. It can't be complete misinformation, right? It's also true that these polarized sides, these different parts, right, that they have very real grievances. That these are not grievances, these are ideological grievances. These are grievances that are very much rooted in people's identities. That is not something you can simply fix through messaging, right, or these other things. So one, if the solution is, say, centrism or bipartisanship or something else, how do you solve for groups that actually don't want to compromise, right? And then I think the other thing, right, is when you mix that with all of the advances that I talked about, particularly people's distrust of mainstream facts, mainstream venues, institutions, and the belief that institutions had failed them, right? The only forward path I see right now is more polarization. But that's why I'm bringing it to you guys, because I think perhaps there's a way that we can look at this and think about what are the pathways forward that think innovatively about this.
Thank you, Leah. I'm particularly interested in that idea of there are those who are rooting for the left solution and those who are rooting for the right solution, and then those who are just rooting for chaos, which is a bigger and bigger group. Okay, Judy Woodruff, I turn now next to you, and we're going to get to Kim Scott, who's on Zoom from a distance, to talk about the high-tech piece of this and of polarization and misinformation and that kind of thing. But Judy, let me go to you first. You've been doing some studying on polarization in your work, and what have you found?
Well, I've been, since the first of this year, that's right, John, I've been traveling around the country trying to talk to as many Americans as possible and as many places as possible to understand from the ground up what's going on. There's no question. I've been covering American politics for over 50 years. I've never seen the country as polarized as it is today. And by the way, it's a privilege for me to be at the table with all of you, this esteemed group, and I'm listening and taking notes to what everyone is saying. I would say at its core, what I see is a profound disconnect. out there on the part of many Americans. And it's for a number of reasons. You all have mentioned it. It has to do with the economy. It has to do with race. It has to do with such rapid changes at the speed of light in technology, how we get our news, how we get our information. It has to do with a change in our politics. Yes, it has to do with political leaders, including Donald Trump, and so many things that are changing so fast in our lives all at one time. And I can't emphasize enough how much it has to do with the economy and with race in what I've seen. But you look at different parts of the country, and I'll get to specifics in just a moment because I do want to be brief. Different parts of the country, you just drive through, as I did 2 days ago, parts of Southwest Florida that were hit by a hurricane a year ago, and 3 years before that, 4 years before that. And there are still mobile homes that are not repaired, but people still living with tarps on top. And there are parts of this country, everybody in this room knows, where people are really suffering, barely making ends meet. We're planning to do some filming next week in Steubenville, Ohio, and we thought, well, one thing we can do is we go there to try to understand people's economic circumstances. And one of my producers said, we're going to go to a food pantry. Well, it turns out I think it's Tuesday or Wednesday when that food pantry opens, they have hundreds of people waiting in line to go to this particular food pantry. This country, for all the, and I just saw a headline this morning, I think it was in the New York Times, about how wealth has increased in this country dramatically. So we have a separation, a disconnect at our core that I think it's hard to think about what we do about polarization in politics without addressing that. Having said that, what I have discovered, and I just want to embrace what Jennifer Lawless said about our political identity, is very much at the forefront of who we are these days. We don't so much think about where did you grow up, what sports do you like, where do you go to church, maybe, how many children do you have. It's all, are you a R or are you a D? And when that becomes your main identity, you do, as Jen, you said, you think of the other side as the bad guys, the other team, and you put them all in that basket, and you assume they all have the same views and so forth and so on. But I'll just tell you quickly, John, what we found is we've visited school board meetings and fights across America, in Oklahoma and Pennsylvania to be specific. These formerly sleepy, quiet corners of America where people discuss curriculum and school supplies are now places where people are yelling at each other and rooting for people to be kicked off the board all over whether books should be banned and whether what should be taught about American history, the history of race in America, LGBTQ issues, and so on. You've all read about it. It's very real. We've been on college campuses where there are fights now over what speakers should be allowed to come to campus, but not just that, over what students can say in class. They fear speaking up because they think somebody's going to pick up their smartphone and record it, and then it's going to be posted online. So this generation is trying to figure out what its role, the youngest generation, its role is in our very polarized society, because they've come from home or communities where they see the political polarization, and they don't know what their role is. We've been to communities in Mississippi, in Western Virginia, rural Western Virginia, and the Panhandle of Texas, looking at the collapse of local journalism. As all of you know, I'm sure 2,500 plus newspapers have shut down in this country over the last decade or two. People don't know what is going on in their own communities. In too many places, the fabric that was holding many of these communities together has gone away. I had a rancher near Abilene, Texas, tell me that the death of the Canadian Record, his local paper, brought him to tears as I was talking to him, because he said, this is the paper that has told me the story of my family. It recorded, my children's birth and my grandson's high school football scores, and on down the list. When there was a wildfire down the road and his ranch was affected. People are personally affected by that, and what they're doing, the reason it's connected to our polarization is that the less news coverage there is of what's going on where you are, you pay attention to national news, and we're getting right to a big subject here, What is national news all about? It's all about the fight. It's about left versus right, us versus them, R versus D, and that defines it. It's the fight that makes the headlines. It's the fight that draws eyeballs. It's all about the fight, and that's not good for democracy, because we have to think about ways to work together. You have to at least consider the idea of compromise, listening to the other side, respecting the other side, or how in the world are you ever going to solve our biggest problems if everybody's in their polarized corners? And yes, our political system is a big part of this, and we've talked to people about that. I won't go into any length on it, but the less civic education, the fact that people don't understand how government works. They do think, I interviewed a man 2 days ago in Florida who thinks everybody in government is on the take. They're all a bunch of crooks. They all need to be removed from office or from their position working for the federal government. And it has to do with gerrymandering, redistricting, money, and on and on and on. It's a big ball of yarn of problems, and I would love to be optimistic. There are so many groups out there that are trying to do something to solve this. Braver Angels, Common Ground, I could go on and on. You know the names of them. They're working their heart out to try to get people just to sit across the table and listen to each other and respect each other. But they're doing it one person at a time. And we've got 330 some odd million Americans, and we're not all divided, but enough of us are who have a megaphone that it feels like we're divided. And so we've got our work cut out for us.
The gentleman you talked to said everybody was on the take. In that pupil I was talking about, the number one motivation that people chose, I think the number was 65% or so, as to why they were asked, why are people in government? And I think 65% said for personal financial gain.
Personal gain.
Yeah. All right, batting cleanup for us is Kim Malone Scott, who's not only written books about how to be successful in the private sector and the habits of mind required to do that well, but also hails from the technology world. And there, the technology world is allowing you to be with us. Kim, thank you so much. So we have at various times talked about social media, and as Judy was just talking about, the death of local media and the abrogation by national media of its role in informing citizens, but in fact just scaring the hell out of them, which is in part the result of the fact that legacy media competes now with social media and in the attention economy. So those are a lot of words I'm throwing at you, but I wanted to get your perspective from the technology world about this conversation we've been having, and also several of us have raised the issue of social media and its role in creating the public space in which presidents have to operate and in which the pressures are put on the presidency.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm not in the room with you, but I'm glad I'm not spewing COVID in the room with you. So, and I want to thank the Miller Center, and in particular the Miller Center control room and the folks who are allowing me to come in over Zoom. I think that, yes, thank you all very much. I think a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of the shifting role of checks and balances in our government. And I believe that our systems were not prepared for the concentration of power that technology has created. And I think a big part of what we need to do here is to think about how to create some checks and balances on the power of tech. And I think this is ironic because Silicon Valley thinks of itself as a force for decentralization, for power to the people, for flat organizational systems, for it doesn't think of itself as powerful. And yet what has happened, the tools that we have built have concentrated power in unprecedented ways in a small number of hands. So I think early on we celebrated tech's role in the Arab Spring, and then we pretended that Facebook's role in genocide just didn't happen. I think we have not come to grips with the way that technology is used by China's government and frankly our own to surveil and control the population. At first, I think it seemed exciting when global leaders would use Twitter to talk But when Trump used it to compare the size of his missiles with someone else's missiles, it was no longer sort of so amusing. I think we believed that the internet was going to make the long tail longer, but in fact, its algorithms are the ultimate rich get richer algorithms, and you have more people going to fewer sources for their information. And not only that, the places where people are going for their information are increasingly polarized. And I think that technology sort of polarizes us for a couple of different reasons, a million different reasons, but I'm going to focus on two, the sort of psychological reasons and financial reasons. First of all, if you think about the way that people interact on social media, it's very different from the way they interact in real life. If you go to a dinner party and you say something that is extreme, you get a bunch of eye rolls, and those eye rolls have the power to silence you. But if you go on to social media and you utter those same extreme views, then you get a bunch of likes. You get and no eye rolls. And so there's a lot of sort of the way that it operates polarizes us and creates more incentives for self-righteous shaming. And we thought we were funding creativity a nickel at a time. Like when we were building these systems, we had no idea sort of where they were going to head. And I think it's also really important to take a look at the financial drivers. It is easier and faster to make stuff up than it is to do real research, to think deeply about policy, to do investigative journalism. And yet the ads go just as fast to the stuff that gets made up as to the stuff that is actually researched and more thoughtful. And this is painful for me. Like I spent a bunch of my career building the AdSense network, and AdSense funded a lot of the early disinformation sort of sites that became very popular. It sort of taught people how to do this. And so that, I think, is something that we really need to think about. And I'm not even going to talk about AI right now, because the impact is going to be faster, more disruptive, and less predictable. And the TLDR on that is, I don't know what's going to happen. And I think there's another part of sort of the finances of Silicon Valley that we really have to talk about, because tech has spawned several centaurs. These are people who are worth more than $100 billion, sorry. And this is frightening. These people are hyper empowered. And there really are no checks on the power that these individuals happen. And this isn't only, I think, a result of tech. It's also kind of the intersection of tech and the Fed, which has pumped $8 trillion into creating an asset bubble since 2008. And that has led to this widening gap between rich and poor. So in the spirit of, I think one of the other problems of tech is that it has sort of demanded that people who do not have policy expertise begin to opine on policy. It's demand, and people, even powerful people, are succumbing to this. CEOs are making policy pronouncements, and they are not trained to do that. So I'm gonna be guilty of that right now, and I'm gonna say I think it's time to start taxing. $1 billion should be enough money for anyone. I'm not a communist, but like $1 billion is enough. I'm just gonna go on a limb. We gotta start creating some checks and balances on these hyper-empowered individuals.
All billionaires in the room, watch out.
You can have 1 billion, just not more than 2.
So we're getting close to the end here, and I promised I would come back. Why don't we do this? Why don't we just have a closing remarks if people have either a final question or a final thought or something that we should take away with for our dinner conversations or for the conversations in the months to come. Does anybody have either a final question or a final thought? Bob, yeah.
I wanted to say something about the strongman presidency as we close. and related to polarization and to sort of the sense in the electorate that there are these existential issues, it's unthinkable that the other side would win. I think we have a real danger that the public wants a strongman president. If you strip away Donald Trump's excesses, if you take away the tweeting and the vulgarity and all of the things that are the unique Trumpian features of the way he went about it, couple that with lack of experience with government, lack of skill as an executive, take all that out. And in a highly polarized society where you have to win because losing is unthinkable, that's where you have the opening for people to say, the president I want is a president who will get it done whatever it takes. Second, the courts is a check, because we haven't discussed it at all. The current attack on the court's legitimacy, whatever its sources, means that we may be seeing a confrontation between the president and the courts in the not too distant future, in which presidents basically say, you're not legitimate, and I'm not going to follow what you just directed or did not direct me or did not permit me to do.
And in which you have members of his party saying the jury system doesn't work, judges are bum. Did you, speaking of judges, Judge?
So, John, if I were studying the presidency today, what I would study is leadership and the complete absence of leadership today, not just at the presidential level, but by all of our politicians. And I would try to discern the reasons for that. There's a question of the chicken or the egg, but I'll start with the leaders. Our leaders today don't really want to lead the country, and they don't campaign to lead the country. Then the egg half of the chicken and egg analogy is that the American people don't want to be led today. And the only thing I've been able to say in 2 years that I really wanted to say was, other than visiting with Judy Woodruff, was I gave a speech at Yale on leadership. And I identified what I called the virtues of leadership. And in that speech, I only had time to speak about 3, but they were the most important 3 of virtues of leadership that I could think of. And that was honesty and integrity and honesty, courage, the courage of leadership, and then my favorite was the humility that is leadership. And I told the students at Yale in that speech that there's not a premium on those virtues of leadership today, whereas up until today, for our conversation's sake, those were the highest values that were sought by all of civilization up to then, but especially in our leaders. And so today, that's the void that I believe accounts for the chaos in America today.
Yeah, one really important point I want to make in response to Jennifer Lawless's discussion is I would much prefer to have dinner with Donald Trump than get a colonoscopy.
On your own or with Donald Trump?
And then on a serious note, briefly, there is a very healthy debate about the proper role, structural and practical, of administrative agencies going on in the courts right now, including the Supreme Court. But the reason and I think that's all great, because, for example, I think so-called independent agencies that serve as both the accuser and the adjudicator, there is actually a due process problem with that. But the reason I don't like concepts like deep state is the same reason that when my daughter first mentioned to me the phrase defund the police, I was taken aback. That was unfathomable to me as a phrase, because what they share in common is a deep distrust in institutions that I worry, if it spreads like a contagion, leaves us without systems and relationships and processes that bring us together. And then I think the final point I just wanted to make was in response to Pete's point about presidents having more capacity to accelerate polarization than decelerate. And then also having these moments to unify. I remember that moving speech after 9/11 at the cathedral, watching it. And let's compare and contrast infrastructure. President Biden, Congress, Secretary Buttigieg, others, as a result of bipartisan compromise, were able to actually accomplish a reform effort that I think most Americans probably agreed with and was a long time in coming, including past Republican presidents and secretaries of transportation. But remember what happened during Infrastructure Week under President Trump. He was talking not about the need for not unifying people around a policy goal that would help all Americans in terms of economics and safety. He was talking about verifying people on both sides. So I do think that presidents do, leaders do have a megaphone that really makes a difference. Agree very much with your points about ground-up forces too. Even absent Donald Trump, we'd have income inequality, racism, all those forces that we would need to deal with. But I think Trump did play an outsized role, and presidents have the ability to unify more than most.
All right, unless anyone else has,
I just
go ahead, Judy.
One brief comment. One way, perhaps, to help the public understand why public servants really do matter in a positive way. I was fortunate this week to attend the annual dinner put on by the Partnership for Public Service, where many of you may recognize they single out individuals in government who've done extraordinary things through their agency, and they had 7 or 8 of them. And things like the 2 scientists at NASA who were involved in making sure that asteroid, that they were doing a test to make sure in the future if an asteroid were going to hit Earth, which we did, a big one, we don't want that to happen, that they successfully hit an asteroid that was zillions of miles away, brought them out, and they talked about what they had done. And for example, the folks at the State Department who worked on bringing hostages back from overseas, and other specific things that they've done around healthcare, around medicine. Maybe if the American people knew more of some of these human individual stories, the people behind this, they would, they might have a somewhat different attitude.
Yes, the SAMIs are the shorthand call, and it's a wonderful thing that the Partnership for Public Service
John,
does.
I just want to go on record and say I choose the colonoscopy.
John,
yeah, go ahead.
John, if I could, because we've been talking about compromise this entire time, how do we get to compromise?
Yeah.
On this question of Trump dinner versus colonoscopy, yes. I would be prepared to have dinner with Trump if, like in a colonoscopy, I was anesthetized.
And with,
I didn't know I was coming to the Miller Center to discuss colonoscopy.
yes, well,
I regret the question.
with all of this talk about colonoscopies, we truly have come to the end.
And I'm a little bummed we don't have a what threat to the presidency does the asteroid present? But thank you all very much. We're adjourned.